A successful entrepreneur, a man known for his humble beginnings, a man who revolutionized the restaurant industry in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu, and perhaps in India. In the 1990s, Rajagopal, the owner of Saravana Bhavan, was known for this and much more. But behind the facade, the veil, if I may call it, Rajagopal hid a dark side. The murder of Prince Santhakumar by Rajagopal and his goons has been covered by the media for many years. But what got me hooked onto the story again is this book, Murder on the Menu by Nirupama Subramanian. Nirupama is a senior journalist, and in this book, she has explored several themes. The meteoric rise of Rajagopal, who left his village in Thoothukudi to build a restaurant empire. The fate of a tuition teacher called Prince Santhakumar, and the journey of his wife, a young woman called Jeeva Jyoti, who fought for many years to get justice. To cut a long story short, Rajagopal is a successful businessman who already has two wives but wants a third one, a young woman called Jeeva Jyoti. And to attain her, he ends up torturing her and her husband Prince for many weeks, and finally he murders Prince. Rajagopal was convicted, but he actually did not spend too much time in jail because he died. This book looks at that and more, and I'm going to be in conversation with Nirupama today. Thank you very much, Nirupama, for speaking to me. My first question to you is, why this theme? Why did you choose this theme for the book? And for, let's say, someone outside who has perhaps eaten in Saravana Bhavan but never ever heard of Rajagopal, how would you describe him and his story?
Firstly, thank you so much, Dhanya, for having me on your show, and thanks a lot for talking about this book. It's been quite a, it was a lot of work over the last year during the pandemic. So I'm really happy that you found it engaging enough to talk to me about it for your show. Thank you so much. About the book, as you rightly said, I knew at the back of my mind that there is a Rajagopal who owns Saravana Bhavan. But really, to tell you the truth, when the publisher called me and said, "Hey, will you write a book on Saravana Bhavan? No, will you write a book on Rajagopal?" I said, "Who Rajagopal?" And the Rajagopal who ran Saravana Bhavan, who owned Saravana Bhavan, and the man who just died. This was in 2019 July, very soon after the Supreme Court ruling confirming his life sentence and his own death within weeks after that. So I had to think about it a bit, but I said yes. The deadlines were very quick, but I somehow managed to pull this book together, mainly because once I started delving into the material for the book, I found there was this was a really fascinating story. It's a study, or in many ways, it's a study of a guy who had different facets to him. As you rightly mentioned, an entrepreneur in liberalized India, where the food scene was bursting, especially in Chennai. You never had the kind of restaurants you had that started in the 90s. You never had them. You never saw them in the 80s or in the 70s. So there was that. There was Rajagopal, the employer, who had all these welfare measures for his workers. And then you had this other side to him. And also because this whole thing resonated with me in a sense, because it spoke to a theme that is also current now, which is the Me Too movement. And I was constantly thinking, as I wrote this whole story, of how had there been social media at that time, how would this have played out in a world with social media? All this happened 20 years ago in 2001, when there was nothing really. I mean, Google had just come in, and there was no Facebook, or there were no WhatsApp, and word didn't spread so quickly as it does now, and you could not publicly name and shame anybody at that time. And also, of course, I also wondered that even if there was all that at that time, would Jeeva Jyoti have been that person who would have done that? Because even now you can see that um, uh, the Me Too thing is only in the big cities and among specific groups of professions like journalists or people in the media, in the film world, and all that. So it hasn't really spread that widely. So I also wondered whether Jeeva Jyoti would have been able to break the barriers of her own circumstances to actually out Rajagopal, even if she had access to all these things at that time. So it was in a sense a story about a crime that had taken 20 years to actually see some form of justice being done. And then, ironically, the man died. So he really didn't go to prison. So it was at one level that kind of story. And on the other level, it was a story that seemed contemporary as well because of how this whole issue of sexual harassment at the workplace, harassment of women generally has been playing out in India, especially since 2012, and also since Me Too became a hashtag. So all these themes were there, and I have to say that I got quite engrossed in writing the story, and I was fortunate enough to have the material that I did, thanks to various people who helped me along the way.
So in the book, you have traced Rajagopal's journey right from the time he leaves his house in Toothukudi district as a boy. He tries many times to go to Chennai to start something on his own. I think it's on his fourth or fifth attempt that he becomes successful. He then goes on to start Saravana Bhavan. So here's a man, perhaps a millionaire, who has a huge restaurant empire, widely written about in the press. In fact, there were Tamil series on him on how benevolent an employer he was. And on the other side, he is what you have described him as a skirt chase. I'm going to just read one or two lines from page 67. You have said, he described his first wife, Valli Ammal, and said, "My soul is satisfied that I have such a noble woman as a wife." And you have mentioned, but even if the soul was satisfied, clearly the flesh was not. Then this man goes ahead and marries another woman called Kritika, his second wife. He later, in a very short amount of time, sets his eyes on a third woman who is Jeeva Jyoti. And because Jeeva Jyoti is already married, he kills Prince, her husband. That's Rajagopal's story. My question to you is, when you went and met so many people, that too after Rajagopal's death, was it difficult for them to really open up about his dark side of his, especially the one where he tried to pursue different women?
I think, in a sense, everybody knew that there was this dark side. And many of them would just sort of say that had it not been for this had it not been for this woman's problem that he had it not been for this particular side to him, he would have been the ideal person. And even I have mentioned in the book that even his wife, his first wife, to know that he had this side to him, but she had just put up with it. I mean, she just resigned herself to it, and she even told the police officials who went to see her once that please, don't obstruct his bail, because you see, we all know that he has this problem, but think of him as a person who employs so many people. He employs thousands of people. So thousands of families are actually dependent on him. So everybody seems to have known at some point that, that he had this issue, but no one actually wants to speak about it openly, in a sense. Yeah, they say, yeah, there was this issue, and had it not been for this issue, it would have been also great. It is unfortunate that he got caught up in this particular case. That kind of the euphemistically sort of portraying the whole problem of him being a womanizer, which he was.
So, Nirupama, I've actually myself written stories on the judgment when it came from the Supreme Court. And of course, I've over the years followed the trial for quite some time. But what really struck me in the book, something which I was not aware of being a journalist myself, is the number of years that this went on. I mean, I had actually thought that this whole fascination that this man had towards Jiva Jyoti was perhaps for a few weeks or months. But in the book, you have described how it went on for years, and perhaps he put everything into action in the last 1 year, till when Prince is found dead in 2001. So, could you tell us, like, I mean, there were many parts of the book which personally disturbed me quite a bit, his acts of cruelty. But can you explain to the reader that to what lengths he was ready to go to actually possess this woman as he himself describes it?
All the material that I have is from the court depositions of various people. So what I'm going to say now is all from the court deposition. So Jiva Jyoti is telling the court at one stage how her mother told her that when she eloped with Prince, she married Prince against her mother's wishes. So when she eloped with Prince, Rajagopal tells her mother that, hey, look, you should have accepted my hand for her, and all this would not have happened. Even now, give me the go ahead, and I will go and bring them back and beat Prince black and blue, have Prince beaten black and blue, and then everything, I'll sort everything out for you. And this she tells the court, Jiva Jyoti tells the court, as something that her mother told her some years later, when this whole when this whole problem became too big, actually. So from that time onwards, he had been interested in her. But I think the real he found that he had acquired real levers over her when she personally wanted some money to start a travel business in Chennai, and then she tried asking various people, and she tried the banks, she tried everywhere, and then she couldn't get it. And then her mother suggested that, hey, we can actually borrow money from Rajagopal himself. And the truth is that the family had been they had been borrowing money from him time and again. So they were indebted to him. He had pulled them out of some issues. So they felt that they could actually go and borrow money from him. And although Jiva Jyoti was a little reluctant, she agreed to this. And then that whole nightmare began from 2000, from the middle of 2001 onward, up to the point where Prince is actually killed that October, at the end of that October of 2000. Yeah, so it was a long pursuit. It lasted years, and it had many twists and turns. And Jiva Jyoti at some point even says in court that her family was complicit in this whole thing, and that they were not supportive enough, that they also were pushing her to marry this guy. So there were all these twists and turns. And one of the reasons that I'm saying that I went only by the court deposition is that many of the things that she said in the court, I would have liked to check back with her, but Jiva Jyoti did not want to speak to me for the purposes of this book, so I could not really ask her about all this in greater detail. So I have very closely hewn only to the court depositions.
But after reading all the depositions of Jiva Jyoti, what is your impression of her as a woman? For me, at least, the fact that she stood firm when the trial was happening, because there would have been many times when she was intimidated, bribed. And there was, of course, a time when the police themselves did not take it seriously, the entire complaint. You mentioned that she had approached a politician, perhaps hinting at J. Jayalalitha. What was your impression of Jeeva Jyoti as a woman, as a person who was fighting for justice?
So here was a woman who was deeply wronged. Her husband was killed, and she had to undergo so many humiliations even before that at the hands of Rajagopal. He would knock on her door at midnight. At a moment's notice, she was taken away to a, a folk medicine practitioner of folk medicine in Tuticorin to be exorcised of the spirit of Prince that seemed to have possessed her, according to Rajagopal. So many humiliations, and also to have people just suddenly abduct you from somewhere and take you to some other place. All of this, I mean, I was thinking as I was reading this, all this material, this is unthinkable. I mean, it's just amazing that somebody thought he could actually pull all this off without any interference from the police. He's so confident that he would never be taken to a court of law, that he could actually get away with all this. So you have the first round of abduction, and where she's already complained to the police, and in that abduction he throws the complaint back at her and says, "You thought you could go to the police? I have your complaint. Here's your complaint." And then, to keep her, to detain her in a room in some office in T Nagar, and then take her again back to this to this place in Tirunelveli, where again they had to undergo these rituals of by these folk practitioners. All this was just too much. But all through this, I could only imagine, because as I said, I did not speak to her, so she did not tell me all this firsthand, but I could only imagine the kind of turmoil and the kind of mental agony that this would have subjected her to. So my first impression of this, of her, and I wish I could have actually got her to speak to me for this book. My first impression of her was this very, very strong person who had lived through a lot in a very short time. I think she must have grown. She was barely, she barely entered her 20s at that time. Imagine, I mean, you're a 20-year-old and, everything happens to you suddenly in 2 or 3 months. And of course, before that, you've been pursued by this old man who wants your hand in marriage, that you have to become his third wife. So I felt that she'd undergone a lot in a very short time. And then after the killing of her husband for 20 years, that whole case stretched on, and never once did mother or daughter recant. Never once did they become hostile witnesses. They completely stuck to what they had told the trial court. They completely stuck to that. So obviously they were very, very strong people. So I think she was very determined that she would see this through the end. And the High Court as well as the Supreme Court have commented on that, have commented on the fact that, we have very few witnesses, women witnesses, who are so determined and so strong to see through to the end. And this is very rare. And both courts commended Jeeva Jyoti and her mother for this stand. So I think it's really admirable. And even the policeman told me that police officials that I spoke to, the investigators, said that, this is the kind of women witness that a police investigator wants, when there is a crime involving a crime against a woman. This is the kind of witnesses that we actually want. This is the ideal woman witness. So yeah, in many
just to ask a small doubt here at this juncture. I mean, Jeeva Jyoti has obviously been brave. I mean, this is a family which could have taken money or even succumbed to pressure when Rajagopal pressured them or intimidated them. But despite all that, she went ahead. She was the prime witness in the case. She ensured that he got punished. But as a woman and as a journalist, I somehow have this grouse against all of us, not anyone else, that eventually when the story was told many times, it still is Rajagopal's dark side, the story of his dark side. It's never been told very emphatically as Jiva Jyoti's story. Do you also feel so?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I do, because you have other crimes against women that are known by the woman. So you say Nirbhaya case. I mean, I don't know. I can't offhand recall the name of uh, of the of the men who attacked Nirbhaya. But you say Nirbhaya case. So in this, it didn't become the Jeeva Jyoti case. It became the Rajagopal case. I think for one, because he's so famous. Rajagopal was so famous already that it was the fact that a guy so famous could have staked his entire reputation, his business, his life's work, his own family, everything on for this on this to go to any extreme to in his pursuit of this woman.
So one good thing about the book is that as much as it told me Rajagopal's story, it also told me Jiva Jyoti's story. In fact, I think this is the first book in which I have read in a lot of detail what her fight was. And so to all the people watching, I would recommend to read the book because it tells you Jiva Jyoti's story as much as Rajagopal's dark side. Another thing I want to ask, two things in fact about Rajagopal himself, Nirupama, is that the whole Tamil series which ran in a magazine about Rajagopal, where he's talked about as his a benevolent employer. He's someone who gives a lot of money to his employees, someone who takes care of their personal deeds. Do you think that would have also resulted in a lot of confusion at that time in the 1990s when this case was, I mean, 2000s when this case was covered? Because by then, the Tamil Nadu media had entrenched themselves into his growth story. Like Annachi was written by everyone. His success story was written by everyone. So do you think the media, like we had an article by a journalist when this whole ruling came, and he wrote, he was trying to remember that in 2000s when this case broke out, a lot of media people sided with Rajagopal because by then he had been known as the benevolent employer. So did you also did you go through media reports then? How did you look at the coverage?
In fact, I was very surprised that there was no regular coverage of the case in in the English language press at that time. I searched and searched, and that is why finally I went to the primary material, which was a court deposition. I think you had a lot of it in the Tamil media, in certain magazines, but I didn't really want to go by that also because that sounded salacious and gossipy and all that. So I think the Tamil media covered it kind of in a much more consistent way for whatever reason. But you're right. I think the first instinct of most men, most people, in fact, men and women, is to disbelieve the woman. The first instinct is to say, okay, here's a famous man. Here's a woman who's making these allegations against him. She must want something out of him. She must want something out of him. She's holding him to it because she wants some personal gain out of this whole thing. So I think there was that element to it. And I think right to the end, these questions have been there around this case, which is also another reason why somebody, in fact, the question that you asked about why the case is not known by the woman's name and by the man's name is also something I asked somebody in her hometown, and he said because he named a couple of cases in Tamil Nadu where the woman's name was attached to the case, not the man's name. And he said one never got this feeling about Jiva Jyoti that, she was, that this was a fight for women's rights, or this was a fight for, this is a true fight for justice. And I hope and wish that one day Jiva Jyoti will come out and actually give her side of the story in much greater detail than I have been able to cull from the court depositions. I think I have a fair amount of her story, but I think she would be in a far better position to do this firsthand.
No, and I think it is very important that she becomes the face, the heroine of this entire story, also for generations to be inspired from. At least that's my personal belief. But Nirupama, when you spoke to so many people, the police, others who knew Saravana Bhavan, if you look at any man who commits a crime like this, especially someone like him, who's known for being an entrepreneur, benevolent, etc. I mean, I keep repeating these words, but that's what he was. How difficult does it become for people to really separate the two? Did you find that? I mean, I know you have even interviewed people who worked with him, his collaborators, his peers, even those who worked under him. But even now, do you find it as difficult for them to separate the two Rajagopals?
Yeah. I think everybody separates the two. Everybody, even the people who eat at Saravana Bhavan, separate the two. No, isn't that right? Because people know that Rajagopal was this guy. Now, I mean, the case is so famous since the Supreme Court ruling. Everybody knows him, or everybody knows about the Saravana Bhavan case. And even at that time, even soon after the murder took place, even after it became a police case and it became quite well known, people didn't stop eating at Saravana Bhavan. So everybody, I think the collaborators, his business associates, everybody, even the people who worked with him, saw him as many different people. They didn't see him as just this one person who went after a woman and then he went after her in such a way as to even murder her husband. I don't think anybody who knew him or who worked with him, and even people who don't know him, I don't think people are seeing him like that.
When I read the book, I was actually thinking, I mean, some of the violence did shock me, what he and his goons did. So at that time, I was just asking myself, Dhanya, I mean, many times you have told yourself you'll not watch the movie of an actor who you know has sexually harassed someone. So would you now stop eating at Saravana Bhavan? I sort of asked myself, I did not reply to myself though, but when we are having this conversation, the question came back to me again. I want to take up another point in the book, which you have followed as a theme throughout, which is his religious phase. Now, in page 17, you talk about this Vana Tirupati temple, which he builds in his village in Puniyadi. He actually, so what Nirupama writes in the book is that when the trial court convicted him of the lesser offense of culpable homicide, and as he appealed the sentence in the Madras High Court, Rajagopal poured 5 crore rupees into building this temple. By the time Vana Tirupati temple was inaugurated in late 2009, the Madras High Court had rejected Rajagopal's appeal and handed down a tougher punishment. But in his hometown, he becomes the one who built the biggest temple. So did you, throughout your investigation while writing this book, believe that he did this deliberately so that there is other path also carved out for him?
Yeah, I think he wanted to leave a legacy which was different from that whole crime. So he wanted to showcase the whole his whole religious side, and I think he was also he wanted to do something for his village from day one. I think he was very keen to develop that village and bring some bring it into the limelight somehow. So how do people do this? I think people in South India especially, a lot of business people build temples, and I think for him this was a very natural choice. He was extremely religious, and he thought that this was the best way to actually put Puniyadi on the map. Many people as you said, in his village remember him as the guy who set up the temple rather than as the guy who committed a crime. And again, that thing, he'd done so much for this village. He's brought so many people, so many tourists come to this village. In fact, the temple is bigger than the village. The temple, and then there's a Saravana Bhavan, and then there's a small hotel where people can stay overnight. All these three put together are bigger than the village itself. I mean, there's so much happening around this. The village has only got 90 homes, and no one hardly anybody stays in that village because everybody is working outside. So the people who remain, they think that he has done so much for this village. And then when you say, but this thing, no, that, it's unfortunate. That's how he got caught in this. He shouldn't have. It's that kind of then messaging that you get.
So women today at least have the luxury of calling out people. There is an element of fear, that luxury which Jiva Jyoti clearly did not have. So you have written the book. A lot of people are praising it everywhere. It's obviously on a very sober subject, but the point is you have told the story from many angles. What is your biggest takeaway after writing this book as you explored all these characters?
My biggest takeaway was, of course, that, how long it takes for a case to go through all the stages of our judicial system and to actually come to a conclusion, for somebody to actually find closure. One reads about it all the time, one writes about it all the time, but going deep into this case, I realized it took 20 years. The world has changed from 2001 to 2019. The world has changed so much technology, so much. Our lives have changed in so many ways. We no longer even go to Saravana Bhavan to order. We'll just order from Swiggy. It's all that. And how long this took. We've literally seen the age changing. We have entered a technological age. And I was just blown by that. That was my biggest thing, that it took her so long to finally get closure on this case. And even then, it was not really a closure because he didn't spend much time in jail, except at the beginning when he spent about 10 months. He did not really live to serve out the life sentence.
In fact, when you were saying closure, I was thinking exactly the same, that Jiva Jyoti never really got closure. Rajagopal spent very few months in jail. He must have lived all his life in luxury, perhaps worried that he may get convicted, but he never actually spent time in prison for the crime that he was convicted for. And that's perhaps why it is important that we do not have 20-year-long trials in this country. But despite all the advancement, the sad reality is that this keeps continuing. So, as media persons, as the public out there, we also need to keep our focus on these cases, to put pressure on courts to really finish trials, etc. So we'll all keep doing our jobs. Thank you very much for writing the book, Nirupama. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, as I said, and I do recommend that if you like to read about real life events, but in not a long, boring book, then you should definitely buy Murder on the Menu. Thank you very much, Nirupama.
Thank you so much, Dhanya. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.